Now, I have to start with a confession. There is a conflict of interest here. Manu is one of my closest friends. I do not know another person in this age group for whom I have such respect and fondness. I have known him for over 10 years and we've been very, very close. We've exchanged lots and lots of emails and plenty of gossip, which I can't talk about now. So we know each other very well. Manu is great, not just as a scholar, he's incredible as a scholar. I'll give you one anecdote. Close to 10 years back, we were talking about something, and I mentioned the Epic of Travancore. That's a book that was written by Mahatma Gandhi's secretary. Say, he's filled it up for me, Mahadev Desai, and I mentioned something in it. And Manu spoke for 5 minutes about the content of that particular part of the book that I mentioned. I got back home and took out my copy of the book and I went through it and I found that he was exactly right. He's a gentleman who reads something like 250 books a year. In his short life, I think he's read about 2 times the number of books I read. So I am frankly in awe of this gentleman. All right?
Professor, I must say I'm very happy that he began this way, because when he pulled out all these files and these sheets of paper, I really was paranoid that I was going to be put to test here. But thank you for the very warm welcome.
Okay. So we don't need to know much more about him. Everybody knows Manu. We know about the fact that he wrote his first book in his early 20s. By the time he was 30, he had finished 3 of them. And then this book has come out. We know that he did his research in London and in America, and he's a famous person in universities there. But what I want to tell you is that I introduced him once to Robin Jeffrey, the historian, and later I spoke about him to Meerananda, the philosopher. And I had a dream. Unfortunately, Mathrubhumi has crushed the dream. My dream was that at this session of MBIFL, there would be a session where there would be Robin Jeffrey, doyen of Kerala studies. There would be Meerananda bringing her Connecticut, New England philosopher's brain. And there would be our young Turk, the only Malayali in the group, and that would be Manu Pillai. I was hoping that I could watch such a session, but it's now just a dream session because Sabin suggested that there is no electric KSRTC bus between Melbourne and Trivandrum. That's why the session did not take place, all right? Well, let's forgive MBIFL for that. We at least have Manu, all right? Okay, so Manu, what I'm going to do is, this is to the audience as well, I am going to try and be a teacher in one way. That is, I have students of whom I'm extremely fond. I'm students I'm not too fond of. But when I evaluate their papers, I always detach myself from my personal feelings. We teachers are trained to do that. So I'll be doing that. If I criticize Manu's book, just remember, I am not criticizing this gentleman. I'm criticizing the book. So I want you to have that distinction in mind between the writer and the book. I see the 2 things as being 2 slightly different things. I'm going to separate the man from the book. All right, Manu?
Let's go.
Fine? Okay, let's go. This will be in 2 parts. First, I will ask some specific questions about the book. I will refer to something he said in the book and I might ask for a clarification or for a comment. If Manu doesn't recall, it's fine. You don't have to, this is not a viva voce. All right, okay. You can pass on. After that, I will have a few other questions which will cover some other areas. But I pick on areas which I think Manu has not spoken about in all the various events he's been having since the book came out. Since the book came out, Manu has been doing 2 things, traveling and speaking. So I hope you will not have covered those areas. All right. Okay, Manu, let's start. So the first one is this. Manu deals with what we will call soft facts, opinions, ideas, beliefs, and they're very, very difficult to master. And Manu has mastered it so well that I think that he's some kind of Roland Barthes when it comes to understanding Hinduism. there isn't a single little sign that he cannot read multiple meanings into, and they're all genuinely meaningful things in that context. So these are the simple questions I'm going to ask. Shall I start? The first one is this. The first reference to nationalism in Malabar, I think, came from a man called Paramekal Toma Katanar. You have not mentioned him in your book. Why is that?
Well, there are lots of things that when you're writing a book of this nature, which is one of these broad sweep books, right?
Yeah.
So for instance, for each chapter, if there's 18,000 words in one chapter or 20,000 words in a chapter, you will probably have 250 pages worth of notes.
I know.
And then my job at least in finishing the book was to condense,
Okay.
see what can be left in, see what can be left out.
Okay.
In that sense, there are lots of absences in the book. For example, you find that while we're talking about modern Hinduism, Ambedkar appears but not in detail.
Yeah, I know.
But one of the reasons I did that is because Mahatma Phule appears in detail, and in many ways Ambedkar is a sort of successor.
Okay.
So I thought, since I've got Ambedkar's impulse already covered through Phule,
Yeah.
then I can afford to not include Ambedkar directly and just refer to him in passing because the content has been covered.
All right.
So because it's a broad scope book of that nature, some people are left in and some people end up being left out.
Okay. All right. Yeah. See, I was just curious because he belongs to Kerala, and this expression of nationalism, I thought, deserved a little more, particularly because you refer to the source from which I got my knowledge, which is one of Sanjay Subramanian's book. It's there in your notes. Anyway, the next question is this. Have you at any point, while writing or speaking, censored yourself?
No. Although, as I have said at previous events, this was the first time in my life, 10 years into publishing, that a manuscript was sent for a legal read before it even went through an editorial process.
Did you do it or did Penguin do it?
No, Penguin did it. To be fair though, they sent it to a lawyer. The lawyer sent back notes on every page saying, this may be offensive, this might upset somebody, this is sensitive, all of that.
Okay.
But Penguin did not once say that I have to follow the lawyer's instructions or suggestions. They said, you can choose.
Yeah.
This is just a way to give you a sense that these are potential vulnerabilities in case somebody wants to make trouble.
Did you have to
These are
change
the
anything
points.
for that?
I changed one or two things. One was just a little humorous aside there, but they were like, look, at this particular juncture, humor might offend certain people. So I said, okay, fine. The other was a quote. But the quote was very, very blunt, a little too blunt in terms of the language it used. And they said, it may be better to paraphrase rather than to quote it in full because the quote is rather too colorful and vivid in its language. So I agreed to do those. So two changes were made out of some 300 changes suggested.
Yeah. I hope Penguin paid the lawyer's fees.
They did.
Yeah, okay, right. So my next question is this. This is a quote from one of your chapters. You say, it's in your introduction, the Puranas are works of genius. Now, I think they're works of poetic genius, but I don't think they are works of philosophic genius. You're suggesting that they are philosophic genius. And then you go on to say, they universalize, they marry the universal to the parochial. Now, my question is this. Practically every line of poetry, I think, in the world does that. For example, Deepastambam Mahascharyam Namakkum Kittanam Panam. You cannot find anything that is more local. You cannot find anything that is more universal. That is Kunjan Nambiar talking about Donald Trump. So my question is, is it quite right to say that these ideas are, in that sense, universal? They're pan-Hindu, but does being pan-Hindu mean being pan-universal?
The word universalize is used in the context of India and Hindu culture, right? So we're basically talking about how the Puranas, and not so much philosophy, but the idea that the Puranas take stories locally and then find a way to weave those stories into a pan-Indian, Brahmanical, Sanskritic kind of sort of framework.
Very true.
But by doing that, it creates a hierarchy, but at the same time, it also allows for something local to become part of a broader narrative. And that framework creation, we can always argue as to whether it was good or bad or whether there's a high and a low in it. But the point isn't that. The point is that it does this as a phenomenon, as a process, and through that creates an explanatory framework for Hinduism, through stories, through legends, by marrying gods, by marrying deities, by picking up local legends and giving them a universal color or a pan-Indian color, by taking the pan-Indian and injecting that into the local. So that's essentially the dynamic that's being referred to over there.
All right, so I'll move on to the next one. This is a quotation that comes from page 334 of, this is a
Towards the end.
uncorrected proof copy, okay? But he will know, he knows it by heart. So, you do not want to digress to other philosophies, like the Charvakas and the Ajivikas, and so on and so forth. Now, just a comment. The comment I have to offer is that if you had actually digressed, I think you would have found that Hindus, Brahmins especially, had neglected Buddhist and Jain systems of logic and thought. And if we had gone along those lines, we may have reached modernity much before we eventually scheduled to. Do you think so?
Well, I think this assumes that somehow, while Brahmins were in control to a certain extent of the way society designed itself and moved forward.
Yes.
I was reading the other day a book by Purushottam Agarwal and David Lorenzen on Jan Gopal, which I think is a 16th century Bhakti saint from North India. And you actually do find that he's making very modern statements. His impulse is extremely modern. He's talking about equality.
Yeah.
He's talking through a frame of bhakti, but he's marrying all of these things that we now recognize as modern, rationalistic, reason-based, but in a very local milieu. So I think those impulses always existed regardless. So even if the Ajivikas and the Charvakas vanished, some of those impulses continued, but the difference is they may have continued behind the scenes or at a subterranean level compared to what was acceptable in orthodox society.
Yeah.
So there's always, the whole of Bhakti poetry is tension between the orthodox ideal, which is Brahmanical in nature, and then heterodox notions that others, often writing in the bhashas, in non-Sanskrit, vernacular, regional languages, they are expressing as well. So I don't think we've lost out
No, we haven't.
those
I think the
impulses.
Charvaka tradition was very much alive. It just wasn't part of the mainstream. That's all. Yeah. And Manu, remember, is as mainstream as we can get. Next one. This is, you say the concept of marital rape was recognized in India long before it was in the West, and that's in page 111. Yeah.
Maybe
And
not
then-
in those terms.
Okay, I think more or less like that. I checked it out
No,
yesterday.
I think the statement is that the concept of marital rape was recognized in 18th century Maharashtra, but not in modern day India today.
Okay.
Today, legally, it's not
All right.
recognized, but it was recognized.
18th century Maharashtra, let it be. My question is this. I checked out the notes. There's a note given there, footnote, and I checked it out, and that is on page 444. And you say that the Brahmin victim of a Muslim rapist could be purified with certain rites. So my question is, that's a strange definition of marital rape, don't you think?
No, that was probably a reference to, rape and how rape was handled in general. But I think the
It's not
footnote
marital
itself
rape.
has more on marital rape as well. Because those Kotwal papers from the 18th century do have a lot of material on marital rape. But then it's about rape culture in general, where you would imagine that in today's world, where even now in parts of India, if a woman gets raped, people think that she's been defiled, her status has fallen, etc.
Yes.
But they actually had this ritual where a Brahmin woman who had been raped, in this case by a Muslim, they actually managed to purify her, and then she could go back to her ordinary married life. Of course, the personal trauma would have continued, but that social function where she was not ostracized, she was not removed, on the contrary, they found a way where she could rejoin society because she was seen not as the culprit, but as the victim.
Okay. You decide. Has he passed part one? Please. All right, Manu. We're
As they
coming
say in
to...
Malayalam, vellam kudippichu.
Hey, sorry. No. So we come to the longer questions, all right? So this is, when did you start writing the book? When you finished the book, did you think that you had achieved what you set out to do?
Actually, in most writers' cases, I think you will find that when you start writing a book or you enter a project, there's a certain idea that you have as to what the book will be, where you're planning to go with it. And to some extent, you have a sense of what your broad conclusion is going to be. But the very nature of history is such that as you go through that process, as you unearth more and more evidence, a lot of your own preconceived notions can change, some of the received wisdom you have can change, And therefore, the conclusions you have, if they don't completely change, they're altered or they're nuanced in a different way. In this book's case, I was 21 and I did my master's dissertation on a connected theme. It was on Hindu nationalism, not on Hinduism as such, but it was connected. And at that time, in my argument that I built up, my professors at university liked it a lot. I got a distinction for that dissertation. But if I read that now, and then this, which was written, 13 years later, this book, there are lots of things that have changed because more evidence, a 21-year-old master's student has a very different way of approaching things. You're still led a lot by the things you've been reading, by your teachers, by people guiding you, and your brain isn't necessarily thinking in its own autonomous sense. You've still got to develop the boldness to connect the dots yourself. Therefore, you're willing to be led. Okay. Whereas by the time of this book, I think there were lots of dots I was willing to connect myself as opposed to being led by existing literature or existing scholarship. So that necessarily also meant... So
when you finished it, were you happy with what you'd achieved?
I don't think I'm ever happy with any book that I've finished in that final moment. Often by the time I finish a book, it's like, like I just want this to be done. Because this...
Remember, your readers are very happy.
Well, I hope so. But this book, for example, I wrote half the book in 2020, about 4 chapters. Then I dumped it to the side and I said, no, I need more time, I need more reading, I need more work. Came back to it only a year and a half or 2 years ago and then revived the project and finished the book. So this book also required gaps because there was so much material to harness that it took me a while to really just get my head around a lot of these things.
Okay, fine. So my next question is this. You quote a lot of metaphysicians, theologians, historians on science. And sometimes when you do that, you put the word science within quotation marks. What we English teachers call sneer quotes. All right? You do not quote one modern thinker on metaphysics or theology. Why is that?
Because we're writing in a certain context, right? So this book is set in the 18th century, 19th century in terms of the modern phase, and then a little bit in the early part of the book is in the Portuguese period. So that's like early modern period. So the science bits appear in the chapter where we're talking about the colonial era approach to science and how Indians saw learning science and having access to scientific material as a way of asserting their identity, becoming modern and being able to stand up to colonialism. So it is in that context that we are looking at what they defined as science, how they approach science. Remember, this is a time when they had race science coming up. They had all kinds of strange notions that we now know are not scientific. But at that time, in the 19th century, when these conversations were happening, they had a very specific notion of science. So that reference to scientific knowledge and the Indian or the brown man's quest for scientific knowledge is happening in that colonial context and why people were seeking it in that political
reading
situation.
The book, the feeling I got was that it had a pre-World War I view of the world of science. And post-World War I, the view is very different. It had a kind of view that Vivekananda would have been happy with. This is a kind of book that doesn't seem to have recognized any intellectual achievement that came after Vivekananda's time. So when it is being written in 2020s, I would have thought, maybe that would have helped the perspective. Anyway, my next question is this.
On that, I'll just say that again, it's very contextual, right? Like this is not a book on science. This is a book on people responding to the idea of science in a social and a political context.
Because science is so often within sneer quotation marks.
Yeah. I thought precisely, because this is their notion of science that we're discussing. It's not necessarily me examining a history of science or understanding what science is for its own terms, or for its own sake. It's more about how did these people view science and how did they use that to generate their sense of identity.
I think the picture would have been full if some thinker of that time had spoken about these people. That would have been a very different view. And that's missing in the book. That's all I meant. All right. So my next question is this. India produced an incredible amount of empirical knowledge. From Mohenjo-daro until today, this is one of India's greatest strengths. Why was India at one point one of the most prosperous nations in the world? Because we had a set of incredible empiricists who were laboring on the land and producing great knowledge. So to give you a very short list of these people, think of the carpenters we had, the bricklayers we had, the metal makers we had, the weavers we had, the blacksmiths we had, the tillers, the cartwrights, the boat builders, the herbalists, the cowherds, the elephant tenders. Remember, Trotman wrote a book on how India had the world's leading technology for 2,500 years. War technology, the war elephant. And who looked after the war elephant? Where did that technology came from? The Adivasi in the forest, not from anyone else. So, lots more. When I wrote down this list, I realized there was more. I gave it up and put an etc. there. So my question is, these are the people who created the wealth. The white man came here to loot. These people are missing in your book. Why?
Because again, the conversations that the book covers are happening at the level of intellectuals. These are people where, for example, there's a missionary called Ziegenbach. He's got a bunch of questions on Hinduism. And he goes to an inn and he's sort of trying to find people to talk to. And there's, for example, a Devdasi there, and the Devdasi says, look, all these questions, you go and ask the Brahmins because they are the ones who are going to be able to answer these religious questions that you're asking.
Okay.
So the book is set in a context where there is missionaries coming in and they are not interested necessarily in the peasant. They are interested in speaking to religious leaders.
Yeah, they want to
They're
convert the
interested in
peasant.
political leaders.
Yeah, they want to convert the peasant.
Sorry?
They want to convert the peasant.
Depends also, because I think the Catholics, when they first came, they did get a lot of peasant converts, but they were not happy. They wanted upper caste converts because they also wanted Christianity to be sheathed within elite society, and that was elite values. So, for instance, in Kerala at one point, the Bible was referred to as the Koravar Vedam because people thought, and missionaries were not happy about it because they didn't want the Bible to be associated just with the Koravar community. They thought, no, we need upper caste people to also respect the Bible, and therefore, missionaries also internalized the notion of caste, as you'll see in the book. Yeah. But the point is, these conversations are happening not at the level of the peasant or at the level of the ordinary person. They're happening at the context of intellectuals, political people, people who are perched in elite positions and in positions of power.
Okay.
Since that is where the conversation is unfolding.
Yeah, that's true. It's the people in power you focused on. Okay, so my next question is, slightly longer, but take a look at this. India had hundreds of territories, and all of them had different customs, different conventions, even laws, and so on and so forth. Even the weights and measures were different, right? Totally different. Now, for example, in some of these places, I'm told that the age of marriage for a girl was 8. There were places you mentioned where it was 12. There were in Kerala, I think it was already 15, and so on. So, in all way, in virtually every way, these were all different societies. When the British took control over India, they wanted a uniform civil code so that they could administer well. They didn't want to administer Delhi in one way and Madras in another way. They wanted one set of laws. That's why they began codifying and creating laws. Now, as soon as they started codifying and creating laws, there was unhappiness. Indians began to protest, because somebody would say, you're not looking after my custom or whatever. Now, my question is, a lot of grievances came from particularly Brahmins and so on because the British were doing it. But without imposing a uniform law over the country, the British could not have administered the place. We had the CAA riots going on for the same reason. But throughout the book, you blame the British for, I will quote you, Indians resorted to nationalism only to accommodate their systems. Would you like to blame the British, for example, for that kind of thing? Because if Indians were the one who were uniting this place, if Sardar Patel and VP Menon and the others were bringing together, the same thing would have happened. So I think the British did the heavy lifting, but we refuse to recognize that. Isn't that being unfair?
Well, I'm not entirely sure which part you're referring to, but I think it's generally acknowledged that the state system we have now, down to the IPC until recently, all of these are British created artifacts that then independent India continued with.
Yeah.
But the point is that the impulse to create a common framework under which everybody would be governed was a colonizer's impulse. Because as you said, They wanted one framework, one structure, because they were outsiders. They didn't have the patience or the cultural resources to go into each part of the country, study each language, understand each caste and subcaste, and then make sense of how these communities operated.
Yeah.
So for them, it was like, let's go to a book, and they often picked up old Sanskrit texts of the Brahmins that were often 2,000 years old, not even relevant as such to the modern period. And they would use this to try and frame uniform laws. And it created resistance on the ground,
Okay.
but not just resistance. There were also Indians capable of manipulating it. They were capable of using it to their own advantage.
Right.
In Travancore, for example, there was this Raja. No, the British had this notion that there was this one uniform Hindu law, which they thought existed in the Manusmriti. And here, after the Veluthambi Dalava rebellion, the Raja of Travancore, then Raja, his name was Avittam Dirnal. His wife, who was an Iyer lady, Arumane Ammachi, she had supported the rebels during the rebellion. So after the rebellion was put down, what did the British do? The British take Arumane Ammachi, take her 40 miles away from the Raja, and they say, you have to stay here, you cannot see your husband. And they try to get the Raja to marry somebody else.
Okay.
Now in the local Kerala system, the Raja divorcing his wife is perfectly normal. In Marumakatayam, you can divorce, you can leave.
Right.
But what does the Raja say? He says, as per the Hindu law that you guys have been referring to, you cannot make me divorce my wife. So the British have brought in this notion of one uniform Hindu law that applies to everybody. And while there is resistance to that, there are also people like this Raja who counter manipulate it when they want to find ways to resist some of these British pressures. So whenever these strange twists in history happen, people accept it also to a certain extent, but they resist it also a certain way.
Now, when the CAA took place, isn't that a replica of what happened then?
I suppose, this is a situation of the modern state in general, right?
Yeah.
Modernity brings in a desire to uniformize, homogenize.
But the British are blamed for doing it. The current central government is applauded for doing it.
I don't think they're applauded.
They're
I
not
think there were
applauded?
plenty of people standing up to CA right here in this room, I guess, and in cities like Trivandrum.
Okay, all right. Right, my next question is, do you agree with Meerananda's, he was a fan of Meerananda? He says her work showed him what social science was. Do you agree with Meerananda's categorization of India and the USA as the world's leading post-truth societies? Post-truth societies.
Well, USA for sure, considering who's in power there now.
India
and
not
what
so
they're
sure?
saying. No, I'm getting there. USA for sure, because we can see it unfolding in front of our eyes. But again, we don't live there, so I wouldn't be too categorical about the US. In India, I think we can see it as well. Ever since the internet phenomenon came in, WhatsApp came in, fake news came in, it's become very obvious that we are living in a post-truth kind of world. But I'm not sure we can say that we are the only ones, because I think it's happening around the world. It's happening in Turkey, it's happening in Israel.
No, she doesn't say we're the only ones. She says we are the leading ones.
Yeah, but leading would also, I haven't read this part of where she says this. But
I know, she doesn't mention Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
All right, my next question. Your book is a bestseller, and I'm told it's selling in hundreds of copies, and I'm really happy. But I've heard maybe cynics say that yes, the book is selling, but not too many people are reading it. Has that reached your ears?
Well, people say that of most books these days, which is that, people are buying books, but how many people are actually reading books? That's a good question, because I do meet people, for example, here in Kerala who say that, YouTube kandittonda.
Okay.
But again, it's not a grievance I have, for the simple reason that we are living in the age of technology.
Yeah.
So as much as I'm committed to writing more books, I'm equally committed to going on podcasts, talking to people on YouTube, having events like this, where the contents of the book can come out to a larger audience, which may not have the capacity to read the book. The other thing is also the economics. This book is priced at 999 rupees. I fought with my publishers. I tried to get them to lower the price, because in India, 999 rupees is still a lot of money. Now, a college kid, even in the metro, will not mind spending 1,000 rupees on a night out, but when it comes to 999 rupee books, they will be they'll be a little hesitant to buy it. So keeping that in mind, I'm an optimist. I think that there is always going to be a crowd that picks up the book and also reads it. Okay. But there'll always be a crowd that also consumes the contents of the book in a different format, audiobooks.
But we won't be optimistic about the fact that publishers will actually lower the prices, because authors want them to.
Yeah.
We have a publisher here. All right, my next question is this. The two most pressing problems in the world today are climate breakdown and inequality. And India leads the world in both these, or that's what some people say. what can Hindu civilization offer as a solution that other civilizations can't?
Good Lord, this is not a question I can answer. This is a question Gandhiji could have answered maybe. And I think if you look at Gandhiji's writings, he perhaps had some,
Yeah, he did think like an ecologist.
In principle, he had a sense that, look, consumerism will not work.
He did.
Mindless industrialization will not work. So it's one of those ironies, right? Even as he makes use of the railways to create a nationalist movement, he's not very fond of the railways because he thinks that a lot of these technologies, while in that initial burst, they will create a lot of jobs, they will create happiness and joy for people.
Yes.
In the long run, they'll come around and bite us in a certain way. So I think more than me answering the question, if we just go back perhaps to some of Gandhi's writings, there may be answers to how to address a question like that. And I don't know if Hindu civilization can answer that. Again, Vivekananda perhaps would have a suggestion on that. I don't think you can draw out principles from thousands of years of history and say that these are the principles of Hindu civilization. Because frankly, each generation finds what it wants to find. Each generation, confronted by certain problems, looks for certain kinds of solutions from the past. So I don't think, as a historian, I wouldn't say that you can go into the past and say these are the broad lessons that our civilization can teach us. But I think there are people in history who might be able to answer or guide people in the present as to how they could perhaps tackle some of these problems.
But nothing that we as a nation can bring that is unique to us.
I don't think we as a nation are even one commodity, right? We like to think that a nation is a monolith. But in reality, just look around our country, right? The number of languages, the number of people, etc. Are we really
potentially
going
the
to be
number
able
of solutions for these?
Exactly. So you can't really turn it into one answer for a nation. I don't think it works that way.
Okay. All right. I'm going to ask you a question. Do you think that your book will continue to be a bestseller for another 980 years?
No, I doubt it. I'd be lucky if it was a bestseller for another year. That's the plan. Everybody's hope is to sell as many copies for 6 months.
Your first books are still selling very well.
That's true.
Particularly The Ivory Throne.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but again, I think everything has a life. I don't think it will sell for that many years. But if it does well enough in my lifetime and continues to give me an income, then I'm happy.
Okay. So my next question, and that will be, I think, one of the last. Oh, we still have time for one or two questions. The next question is, when you sat down to write the book, you said 2020, 21? If I remember right, that is a time when the protests were happening in Shaheen Bagh, when the Jamia Millia University students were being targeted, when modern technology, cell phone records, Aadhaar card, surveillance technology was being used by the union government to pick out people who lived in parts of Delhi and to target them and to kill them. This was going on. We know that. We seem to have forgotten it, but we only have to read a little bit of history or remember what we followed on TV, aghast. This was going on. That was the time when you were writing this book. Did it ever strike you that the nationalism, the growth of which I am describing, is now expressing itself on the streets of Delhi?
It did, in the sense that obviously one of the reasons I even wrote this book is because even as a master's student, right, I grew up in my teens, which is when Vajpayee's government was in power. These conversations were bubbling up in general, right? I remember when I was still in school, in the year 2000, there were all these books that came out about India being the next big power. People wrote books about Sunil Khilnani's book, Shashi Tharoor wrote books. It was just very optimistic, this is India's age, the 21st century is India's age. Books of that nature were being written. But as I came into my teens, obviously we were reading Meera Nanda, we were reading other kinds of literature, and we realized that the romantic image has certain problems, that it's not as pretty as we'd like some of the narratives as they did suggest. And therefore, for that reason, I think that self-doubt was there, which is why even as a master's student, I went into this topic to investigate where does this impulse for Hindutva, for example, where does this impulse for this kind of cultural nationalism, religious nationalism even come from? But again, when I was doing this book, initially my plan was in the epilogue to bring it down to the present. It was eventually a decision not to do it because in conversations, in TV interviews, YouTube shows, while I'm very comfortable expressing my opinion on what is happening in our world today, I also didn't want the book to be overwhelmed by what is happening today, because ultimately this is describing things that happened from 1500 till the early 1900s, so till about 1920, 24, when Savarkar writes Hindutva. So that's the swathe of historical time being covered. And I had a paranoia that if I bring the book into the present, then all the discussion will be about the present. Everything will, the book will be hijacked by the ending of the book rather than the remaining 80-90%
in reality,
of the book.
that's how it's happened. So there, I found more of Pune and Maharashtra in the book than Maveligara. Comment?
I mean, yeah, the book begins in Goa and Kerala and then winds
No,
to Tamil Nadu.
the spirit of the book is more the Tilak and Savarkar spirit.
I mean, because you're describing the rise of Hindutva, right? So you're trying to find out where does Hindutva come from? Whether you subscribe to it personally or not, whether one likes it personally or not. When you're investigating it, you have to really understand what these people did. So I had to look through all of Tilak's writings in Marathi, read it, try to make sense of it, try to understand where is this man even coming from and what is motivating him. It's not necessarily what I believe or what I think, but I'm trying to get into his head to understand what is the impulse driving this man to try and define Hindutva to start with. He tries a definition of Hindutva, it doesn't work. Savarkar is somebody who's his protege. Tilak writes a letter of recommendation for Savarkar to go and study abroad. Savarkar dedicates his first book to Tilak, so you do see a continuation there. And then Savarkar is the one who creates the lasting definition of Hindutva that we are still living with a century later. So in that context, and again, you mentioned the Maharashtra thing. Even today, the RSS headquarters is in Maharashtra. Even today, its leadership is Maharashtrian Brahmins. And the point made in the book is that the Maharashtrian Brahmins, their history as a community, going back to the Peshwa period, has an important role in understanding the rise of Hindutva and Hindu nationalism in general. Because they were a community already in the 18th century that were Brahmins by caste and had a certain privilege, social dominance. But they also become warriors, the Peshwas. So they're also militaristic, they're also fighting, and they see themselves as replacing the Mughals, as replacing Islamic rule. So it is in that context that a Savarkar and a Tilak are both born. They're born into a community that sees itself as very sort of masculine, militant, and elite and Brahminical in nature. And that composite, I think, explains why Hindutva as a concept finds its bearings in Maharashtra rather than Bengal, for example. Even in Bengal, people were trying to define it, but it doesn't take its lasting form in Bengal because Bengal also has an anglicized tradition under Ram Mohan Roy and all of those people. It takes its lasting form in Maharashtra and for a very specific reason, which is the region's history.
That brings me to my last question. A little bit of definition before that. I'm going to define the word secular. In India, we take secular to mean treating all religions as equal. But the original meaning of secular is not that. It is to think of the universe and the world as a place where natural laws operate, where theology is totally different from all the other subjects. In that sense, will you ever write a secular book? Because your book comes from within a belief system.
I mean, that's a tough question to answer. I suppose life is long. I don't know what kinds of books I will write.
I'm thinking of your career, Manu. I want you to write some great books.
Thank you. No, but again, it depends on the themes that you're interested in. For example, if one were to take the same topics in this, and people have done it, right? So you can take the same topic of religious nationalism and view it completely from a secular lens and then try and pick holes.
There are many books like that.
Yeah. But you can also try and understand religious nationalism from where is this coming from within the tradition.
Yeah, those people look at that too.
Yeah, so depending on what the theme is, what the topic is, what I write in future will again vary. But I don't know. That's a tough question to answer. Life is long, so
you
we'll
were
see.
at KLF just a month back, and I think the book that won the best book at KLF is a very good example of that kind of a book. The Identity Project by Rahul Bhatia. That's right. Okay. So if I were giving a lecture, I would now give a long book list. I can't do that here because that would be a less than subtle insult to an author. All right? Because the long book list would be books that would add to our understanding of the theme that Manu has tackled. There's one thing I did not mention. I told you I'm in awe of this man. I still am in awe. And one of the reasons is that there is one thing that is missing in India today, especially among young people. There is a lot of aggression, there is a lot of ugliness, there is a lot of anger. Even our national lion is snarling now, isn't it? In that world, Manu is a role model. You can't find a more courteous, a greater gentleman. This is the archetypal scholar, gentleman. It was a pleasure talking to you, Manu.
Thank you, sir. I wasn't expecting the compliments, but thank you. Thank you very much.
It's true, all right? If young people want a model in every way, Manu Pillai is a model to follow. Now, anybody in the audience who has questions?
So I agree with you, sir. I think at his worst, Manu is incapable of being anything less than brilliant.
Yeah.
So my question is, I was curious because in your narrative, I think the omissions shape it as much as the inclusions. And to give an example, you started with Akbar to the rise of Hindutva under Savarkar. But you kind of left out, and you also mentioned the persecution of Hindus by Christians, like the Portuguese to start with, which shaped their more muscular, aggressive identity. But I was curious as to why you left out Aurangzeb, because he's part of the dialogue today and he occupies that same time frame. And also the Devdasis, they're mentioned only in passing. The anti-Nach movement was huge then. And regarding the shaping of modern Hindu identity, it's soft power today. The classical dances, Kathak, Bharatanatyam, classical music, that's also part of the modern Hindu identity. And the Bhakti movement might have influenced Gandhiji, who, as you pointed out, clashed with Savarkar regarding identities. And to paraphrase something in your book, my question is
Okay,
right here.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm done. To paraphrase something in your book, the Brahminical stream is only a small but powerful part of the ocean of Hinduism. Wouldn't that, that would also apply to Savarkar and Hindutva ideology,
Yeah.
right?
In fact, a review that came out of this book in the Financial Times abroad said the exact same thing, where the reviewer commented that I don't go into the present and what's happening now. And then he goes on to say that actually that's not a weakness, because if I make the end point of the book Hindutva of the present, that implicitly suggests that the end point of the Hindu identity is what we are seeing today. Whereas even now there's resistance to that. The chapter has not been written. We are living through the present and we may feel under siege or whatever, but that's not been completed. That's not been written. There's still resistance. So what this will lead up to, what the end point is not actually clear. Which is why some of those omissions are there precisely to get the reader to challenge their own notions of what they think the end point is. On the Devdasis, they've been covered in some of my earlier books, right? From my first book, for example, the then Rani of Travancore outlawed Devdasis in Travancore. So I've covered some of that in earlier books. And at the beginning of the session, we spoke about how not everything can be included in a broad sweep book like this. When you're zooming out, as opposed to doing a granular study of one subject or one theme, necessarily you're going to leave out certain things to make a broader point. So it's not going to be easy to bring that in. On Aurangzeb, I think, so this is a question that's emerged in other events also, where people say, what about the Hindu-Muslim encounter? Which I described briefly in the introduction, but the rest of the book is about the Hindu-Christian encounter. Frankly, the Hindu-Muslim encounter requires a different book. The thing is, there's so much material there. It comes from a different period. It begins in the medieval period. This book is early modern and the modern period. It's
Please
about
don't write it. We don't want another Salman Rushdie.
No, but it requires a different book. It requires a different expertise. You need to be able to read Persian. You need to be able to read Arabic. It requires a different expertise. But there are scholars working on it. In fact, while I was doing the research for this, just as Hindus were sitting and having public debates in the 19th century with Christian missionaries, Muslims were also having debates with Christian missionaries. And there's a wonderful amount of literature on Muslim-Christian encounters in the same period. So that, frankly, is a different book and a different project, rather than trying to sort of squeeze everything into this one book. Already this is 600 pages. And about 250 pages is notes, 350 pages or so is
Of
the main text.
smaller font. The font is much smaller.
And-
I know,
and-
I used a lens to go through it.
And had promised myself after the Ivory Throne, which was 700 pages, that I would never write such a long book again, because it's just unwieldy. I think sometimes to get your point across, you need to be able to structure it as well. It's like a piece of marble. Unless you actually sculpt it into a certain shape, it's still marble either way, but to communicate something, you need to sculpt, and you need to sculpt selectively.
All right, any other question?
Manu?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Where?
So your books have had a profound impact on people of my generation and younger generation, especially because the kind of history research that I've been doing. At the same time, while audiobooks have been bestsellers, there is a parallel list of books that take the same bestseller list, be it a Saidi book on India, that is Bharat, or whatever Vikram Sampath writes on Savarkar, or his recent books on Tipu Sultan. Since you have covered the Sultanate and all, so what Ram Sampath says is that there's a lot of research which talks about his view on how Tipu was killed, how Tipu's perception is different from what have been originally being perceived to. So are you in consonance with those thoughts, or have you got a chance to compare notes on where they are coming from?
I think I read very widely because I want to know what all sides are thinking, just to get a sense of what the argument is and what the point of view that's trying to be presented is. But again, the force of any argument is also how good the evidence is, how well the dots have been connected, and how compellingly it's been connected. So there's a lot of books that will make it to the bestseller list, partly also because it is the season. In this season, a certain type of book will sell. So for that reason, there's people. There's a lot of books, and I was talking to somebody about there are publishing houses of a certain political leaning which survive because, government places mass orders, libraries under the government place mass orders, and that allows a certain ecosystem to thrive. It's fine. Ultimately, the best idea will sort of sit on the shelves for longer in a certain sense. I think down the line, even if right now the sort of the floor tilts in one direction, the power of a good book is that a good book can make the floor tilt in another direction down the line, maybe long after people like us are gone. But I think therefore for that reason, it's okay for other books to exist, and it's okay for us to engage with those other books also and try to see if there is anything worthwhile over there. Ultimately, reading different perspectives and understanding different perspectives all enrich the mind. It's just the question that, are those perspectives sound in the way they've been expressed, and do they actually compellingly communicate what they claim to conclude?
We have dozens of ex-families or so-called Raja families across the country. Do you think that in the new political situation, are they getting connected with the Hindutva politics in general?
Who's getting connected? There's an echo, so I couldn't hear clearly.
See the Raja families,
The royal families.
royal families in India, across the country. Do you think they are getting connected more and more with the new Hindutva politics?
Well, if you look at the history of it, you'll see that one of the biggest financiers of the Janasangh back in the day was a royal, Rajmata Vijaya Scindia in Gwalior. She backed what was the BJP's ancestor financially for the longest time. One of the reasons Indira Gandhi abolished the privy purses was not because she was a great committed socialist necessarily, but because the privy purses were funding parties that she disagreed with fundamentally. Of course, there's a question to be asked whether that was the right thing to do. It was also authoritarian of her perhaps to try and wipe out funds from her enemies that way. But I think that was the reason. She was aware that the privy purses, these large amounts, Travancore used to get 18 lakhs a year, not that they did it, but other Rajas in the north were using their resources to fund parties that were not the Congress, including parties on the right. So to that extent, and coming from families that are traditionalist in nature, it doesn't surprise one that many of them are wooed by the BJP and the right-wing parties today. The current titular Maharaj of Mysore is a BJP MP now. The Congress had Mr. Scindia, who's now skipped over to the party that his aunts and his grandmother belonged to. So I'm not surprised because Travancore, I don't know. Are they in politics
Your
though?
guess.
Well, Travancore, they sent me a defamation notice for my very first book, so I can't say I'm best friends with them. But I don't know if they're active in politics directly in any sense. I've never heard of any members standing for election or anything from the Travancore family, at least.
Hi, I am.
Where are you?
Yes, hi, I'm Asta. I'm from Bihar. I'm someone who has made Kerala home for the last few years. So, as someone who's from Bihar, it is quite well known that being called a Bihari is quite derogatory even now. So do you think, but I find the opposite in people of Kerala, and I find that people here are very proud of the way they dress, what they speak, what they eat, and the festivals. Do you think somewhere the fact that Bihar and Eastern India or Northern India has been under the British for longer, comparatively longer, has got something to do with how we identify ourselves today?
I don't think it's necessarily the British that can be blamed for this. I think one of the things is poverty, which is that in general, and this is the north-south divide that so many people are talking about these days, which is the south historically has been able to develop a certain way, whereas the north hasn't. even if you forget the 20th century, in the earlier periods, their historical trajectories were slightly different because the south was a peninsula. So being surrounded by water on all three sides, being surrounded by trade and trading networks on all three sides, meant that the kind of culture here was slightly different. For example, literacy was also historically valued in southern places because trade requires accountants. Accountants need to know mathematics and language. Therefore, there was a certain kind of ripple effects that this causes in the peninsula. In the north, perhaps the trajectory was slightly different. You find in places like Bihar, the history is different, the course of events is different, who ruled it is different. All of that makes a difference. I don't think it's just British rule. And then the subsequent economic condition of the place. If you look at the broader historical arc of India, Bihar was where the great empires were. Ashoka was a Bihari in many ways, right?
But then Bihar was where opium and indigo was forced to be grown.
Yeah. So,
Instead of grains.
that's true. But again, parts of Kerala were also under the British, right? Malabar was also under the British. So I don't think we can generalize that the British and the parts that they ruled are somehow less proud of their identity versus places that were under, say, royal rule or whatever. I think there are broader sort of, historical dynamics in play.
Hi, sir. I'm Sangeet Krishna and I'm a 12th grader. My question to is, like growing up in a place where there is a lot of culture, a lot of heritage, we have been heard different stories about the past, which is now also connected to our modern living. So one example is that of Onam. Some say that the homecoming of Mahabali. Others say that it's the birthday of Trikkakarappan or Vamanan. And in Hindu Puranas, it is mentioned a kind of same incident, but it's happening in the banks of Narmada River and it's now in Gujarat. Bhrigu Kachamai. So in that it is said that it's not Mahabali, it's an Asuran called Bali, and the same incidents as the established narrative of Onam, it's mentioned there. And one incident that is not even sent to Padalam, but it's sent to another world where Devans also crave to go. So my question to is, can you comment on the modifications that is being happened to the stories from being passed to generations and generations, the alternations that are being done?
Well, firstly, in the 19th century, there was a theory that Patalam was actually America. So according to that theory, maybe Mahabali was sent to America. But jokes aside, the thing is, legends of this nature always travel. In Kerala, we have the story that Parashurama came and stood and he threw his axe from Gokarnam to Kanyakumari, and that's how Kerala was born. You go up the coast in the Konkan, they move the same story to their geography. And they say, oh, Konkan also came up because of Parashurama. The Nambudris in Kerala say, we were settled here by Parashurama, when he created Kerala. Nambudris, the Brahmins of Tulu say it, the Brahmins of Konkan say it, the Brahmins all the way up to the Gujarat coast say it. Because legends have a way of traveling down and people appropriate those legends to give a sense of meaning to their own stories. Sometimes what happens is also local heroes and local deities get fused into some of these legends. When we're talking about Puranic stories marrying local with pan-Indian, this is a dynamic like that. You're referring to, of course, the Narmada story around Bali. In Maharashtra, he's called Bali Raja, and Pillai writes about Bali Raja. Here we call him Mahabali. Right now, what you're seeing about the whole emphasis on Vamana, I think this is a relatively recent innovation in Kerala, at least. If you ask anybody's grandmother, anybody's grandfather sitting in this room, they would typically say that this is the homecoming of Mahabali. Mahabali you're showing that you're all happy, so that Mahabali is not unhappy that he'll abandon us and left Kerala or whatever. So that's the story that has been received across generations in this place. This whole Vamana emphasis is a more recent phenomenon that's come up for other reasons, which is not to say that it doesn't have power. If, say, current political trends continue, in 200 years from now, people might have reinterpreted the story to think that this story is actually about Vamana and not about Mahabali. But that's also about how stories
Manu,
change.
may I just add one thing? You keep mentioning this Parashurama thing. You hear it everywhere in Kerala. My question is, should our children also not be told the geology behind the formation of Kerala at some point?
So yeah, stories travel that way.
Only stories travel. The truth never travels.
Good line.
Good evening, Manu.
Where are you?
Yeah. Yes. Good evening, Professor P. Vijaya Kumar. Thank you for the session. My question is with regard to the medieval Kerala and the part of Malabar which was usually uncomfortably forgotten. Also because as the recent book by Dr. V.V. Haridas from Calicut University titled Zamorenes and the Political Culture of Medieval Kerala talks about that there's a lack of data available on the Zamorenes and the Samudri Raja of Malabar. So do you plan to write something on medieval Kerala? Because we have an immense plethora of information with regard to the Mughals because the texts were preserved accordingly. But here that's not the case. And we have a habit of referring to the Samudri as a local chieftain rather than a king. So what's your take on that? And another question which follows it is, usually fictional representation of a period which was forgotten kind of leads readers and consumers of that data to work upon that area. Do you welcome that fictional intervention into a past, which welcomes?
On your second question, yeah, I mean, I think there's always space for historical fiction. Good historical fiction will always do good research first and then recreate that world. There's also going to be sloppy historical fiction, but that will always be sloppy historical fiction. So there's no point, beating your chest over it. It's fine. Let people do what they want to do. On your early question, no, I don't think I'm suited or capable of handling the Zamorans. It requires, again, a different set of skills. Old Malayalam, you have to be able to read and understand old Malayalam. On top of that, yes, there's a resource issue in terms of the kind of material that's available. A lot of the Zamorin records were destroyed. They were destroyed during the Mysore invasion. Before that, they were destroyed in a fire. So you actually have references to how a lot of although when the Portuguese came, they found a huge secretariat around the Zamorin constantly keeping records and tracking things on olas or whatever. Because this is a tropical country and tropical climate, those olas also disintegrate. What hasn't disintegrated has been destroyed in war. I went to the Tali temple to see the Zamorin sword. The Zamorin sword is now permanently in a sheath because it was splintered in a war, in an explosion, and it broke into pieces. That's how even the sword is kept. A metal substance is kept today. So you can imagine the olas and the palm leaf manuscripts, a lot of them would have Dravikafied. Yet there are some sources and there are some people working on it. There's a professor called V.V. Haridas who's done a very good book on the Zamorins, and he studied the Zamorins. Dilip Menon has done some interesting work on the structure of the Zamorin state. So you said the Zamorin was called a chieftain and not a king, because the Zamorin state was not a centralized state as we understand states or kingship today. It had a slightly different, looser kind of structure. So there are scholars working on it, but I don't plan to go into that.
May I add to that, ma'am? There are a couple of books by Sanjay Subramaniam, who looks at manuscripts in medieval Persian, in medieval Arabic, in medieval Portuguese. And there is more information there on the Zamorin than all the sources that we talked about. All the Zamorins and Calicut and the Kerala and the Malabar coast. Much more information there. And this has been unearthed in the last 20 or 30 years. Much of it because of the work that has been done by Sanjay Subramaniam.
My question is, how did you influence this much Travancore historical events in your writing journey? Is there any other reason behind that?
As to why I chose to write on Travancore? Yeah. Well, just general interest. I came here, I used to come to Kerala every few months on holiday. I grew up outside, so I used to come here. And there were lots of stories I picked up. Initially, they were local stories about my ancestors, village stories. In fact, earlier I met a gentleman from my village in the author's lounge. That then became an interest in the region. It became an interest in Travancore. From there, I sort of got, into the story of Sethu Lakshmi and decided to write a book on that. But other than that, there was no grand design or interest in Travancore as such. I just found a very compelling moment and a compelling personality whose story hadn't been told. And that just took over my life, and I felt like I had to do something to tell that story.
See, some of us have been trying to persuade Manu for a long time to write a single volume history of Kerala. He refuses to do that. Can you please ask him to do it?
I still refuse to do it.